My name is Neil Piper. I'm the managing director at the Presidential Precinct. And the Presidential Precinct was founded to help young emerging leaders from around the world through the collaboration through some of the brightest minds and historic resources we have in the United States. We unite 6 landmark institutions: the University of Virginia, College of William and Mary, and the homes of 3 founding fathers: Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, James Madison's Montpelier, James Monroe's Ashland and Highland, and William Short's Moorhead. And to date, we've had programs since our inaugural event in 2012 bring through over 135 young leaders from 65 countries and 6 continents here in Central Virginia through the precinct. Through the German Marshall Fund, the State Department, the Community of Democracies, and we were just selected by the Obama administration to host the Washington Fellowship for Young African Leaders. And this is a White House initiative to really propel economic development and prosperity and democracy across the continent of Africa. And we're very fortunate, starting this summer, to have a cohort of 25 young African leaders. It's a very competitive program. There were 50,000 applications come through, which is amazing. That we'll have 25 of those arriving here at UVA on June 16th. And we'll have a 6-week curriculum really built around helping these young leaders, these future leaders of countries all across the continent, build better, businesses and help in the ministries and build better governments. And so it's an honor to be here tonight, and I'll keep my introduction short and brief. If you have any other questions after the program, I'll be glad to talk with you later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, without further ado, we'll pass it over to Evan Prohaska. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. Thanks for everybody showing up. It should be a great talk. I think we're going to start. Everybody's just going to give a little 3 to 5 minute kind of spiel on their thoughts on this question of promoting democracy abroad. I'll talk. We'll kind of guide a conversation for maybe a half hour, and then open things up to you guys. So start thinking about questions. That'll be the bulk of the presentation. Mike, you can kick off.
Okay. So I want to first thank IRO, Presidential Precinct, and Democracy Network for having us. I think this is a really important topic and has been so for some time. So as of 2011, the Costs of War project at Brown University estimated that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq would surpass $4 trillion, with 330,000 casualties in terms of men, women, and children. Each of these wars, of course, were waged with a variety of purposes in mind, some of which were worthy, others of which were severely misguided. Of the most controversial of these objectives is the issue of democracy promotion, at least in the post-invasion phase. That is, efforts by the United States to actively promote democracy on the rubble of newly toppled autocratic regimes. My remarks this evening will not focus on these 2 specific wars, but rather the broader theme posed to the panel, and that is, should the United States actively promote democracy? And so in the remainder of my time, I'll make 3 primary points. The first point is that international relations scholars can tell us a lot about why the proliferation of democracy is generally a good thing. The second point will be that the misappropriation of these ideas can be extremely dangerous, especially when misappropriated by policymakers with the authority and influence to actually affect policy. And the third point will be that democracy promotion is feasible, but the ways in which the United States and its allies should promote democracy is dependent on context, and I'll say more about that. So I'll take each of these points in turn. The first is that international relations scholars can tell us a lot about why the global advancement of democracy is a good thing. The democratic peace is one of the most canonical theories associated with international relations, the idea that democracies have not fought wars with one another. That is, they have carved out a separate zone of peace between them. While scholars are, of course, divided along the mechanism through which the democratic peace observation exists, the idea that democracies don't fight one another is relatively well accepted in the international relations canon. So making the hopefully uncontroversial assumption that war is a bad thing and more peace is a good thing, why should we not actively promote democracy if we believe that the democratic peace is a valid empirical observation? This leads me to my second point, and that is misappropriation of these theories, such as the democratic peace, can be an extremely dangerous enterprise. And of course, you'll notice that policymakers don't always explicitly invoke the words democratic peace to talk about this relative concept. Recall here Bush's 2005 inaugural speech, when he claimed, quote, that the best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world, end quote. And the reason why it could be dangerous to misappropriate this idea is that democratic peace theorists are, with little exception, speaking primarily about what relations are like between existing democracies. Democratic peace is not a theory of regime change. And therefore, some proponents have in fact argued that when states are in democratic transitions or democratizing, they may actually be more belligerent, that is, more likely to initiate conflict than mature democracies and even mature autocracies. So therefore, by promoting democracy where the conditions are not yet right, democratizing countries may actually be more belligerent. And so when countries are experiencing democratic transitions and are years or even decades away from consolidation, we may actually have a more dangerous world in the meantime. The cure of democracy promotion may be worse than the disease, increased conflict. My final point is that democracy promotion is possible, though the ways in which the United States should promote democracy are context-dependent. That is, it depends on the conditions of the target state where we are trying to promote democracy. Factors such as low levels of economic inequality, high levels of economic development, low levels of societal fractionalization, some previous experience with a democratic form of government, are factors known to be conducive to the consolidation and advancement of democracy. Absent these factors, however, the prospects for democratization are relatively bleak, and forcibly promoting democracy where these conditions don't exist is unlikely to be a panacea. Think here for a moment of trying to make a tree grow in a concrete pool shielded from sunlight. It's unlikely to happen. So the most promising pathways, the takeaway point is that the most promising pathways for democracy promotion are to promote these factors that make for democratic consolidation possible. Reducing levels of economic inequality abroad, providing aid provisions that increase the level of development, promoting moderation and cooperation, and reducing fractionalization within society. And notice that none of my remarks rule out the use of force as one tool through which democracy might be promoted. But the idea is that we need a more holistic approach that reorients us away from using force towards a more holistic approach that accounts for the factors that make for democracy more likely. And to paraphrase a prominent scholar on regime change, we need to move away from the idea that we can promote democracy through bayonets.
Good. I also would like to thank Democracy Network, the IRO, and the Presidential Precinct for sponsoring this. Is a terrific event, very timely. It won't surprise you that my remarks, I agree with what Mike just said. We co-authored a paper together and work together. So I will make 2 points, though, not 3. And the first will be a bit of an elaboration of one of his points. My second point will be more of a caution, but not the same caution that Mike issued. Mike mentioned the so-called democratic peace, which is the proposition that liberal democracies don't fight wars against one another. They do fight non-democracy, so this is not a claim that they're pacifistic. The United States has fought a lot of wars. Britain, France, they fought a lot of wars. So it's not that claim. They don't fight each other. And this is a social science finding that's held up through a number of statistical studies on lots of data, lots of control variables, and so on. It was anticipated by the Prussian German philosopher Immanuel Kant back in the 1790s, who wrote a series of essays about international relations, one of which is called Toward Perpetual Peace. Kant, contemporary of Mr. Jefferson Madison and so on, writing in the same kind of Enlightenment milieu, using his reason, said that Republican government, as he called it, is more rational, and republics will behave more rational, behave according to the interests of the citizens. The thing about the democratic piece, though, is it's not just an inference based on a 200-year-old essay by a philosopher. It does have a lot of empirical social scientific backing. So that does provide one reason to promote democracy, holding all else equal. There are other findings that Kant really anticipated. Let me just talk quickly about those before moving to my second point. Democracies also, it turns out, trade with one another more. And international trade, all else equal, raises national income. People lose from international trade, but national economies generally win from it. That's why there's such a drive in the modern world to lower trade barriers and to open up the global economy. Democracies also invest in one another's economies more. They have more migration among each other, so the movement of labor is freer among them in the aggregate. So there are all sorts of economic efficiencies that come with democracy. You join a club of countries that generally trade freely. That will help you and help them and so on. Democracies also tend to belong to more international organizations, and they stay in those longer and they obey their rules more. There's even a scholarly literature, very empirical on this, that says democracies are better at keeping international commitments. This may seem a little odd because we can think of a democracy as electing a new president or a new parliament, a new party, and we would think the new president, the new parliament would overturn the treaties, and that does sometimes happen, but it turns out that in the aggregate it happens less often with a democracy than with a dictatorship, which is open to the whims of the leader's latest mood or a military overthrow of the regime and that sort of thing. So by and large, again, looking over decade after decade and country after country, there are all sorts of advantages that accrue both to the world economy and to each individual democracy when the number of democracies spread. And this is setting aside any kind of moral argument we might want to lodge about spreading democracy. Those arguments exist as well. I don't mean to shortchange those, but those aren't the ones I want to address. I'm just addressing simple self-interest. So all else equal, it's better for the United States and Canada and Japan and other democracies, the more democracies there are out there. It may still be imprudent to promote democracy by force in particular cases. It usually is. It might be imprudent to promote democracy through other means. That's a separate question, but how you do it and when it's prudent. But the basic fact to get across, again, finishing on my first point, is it is better, and there's very good social science to back that up. Second point I want to make is related, but it's a caution. Many people who would agree with everything I've just said, many scholars would say that that's the end of the story, you don't need to say anything more. There's a school of thought in international relations that some of you will know called realism that says the problem with what I've just said is it ignores power. And so I want to bring power into the picture very quickly and acknowledge something that should give us pause when we think about, say, Ukraine and Russia now. When democracy spreads, it is a net gain for the United States, usually. And the United States is the world's only superpower. It has a lot of power already. What I've just said, my first point, is really about, in part, increasing the power of the United States by making the world a friendlier place to U.S. interests. The upshot of this is Vladimir Putin, and I'm not a fan, believe me, is not crazy to think that if Ukraine becomes a liberal democracy, it is a net loss for Russian power and a net gain for the United States. And to think about it this way: the people in, especially Western Ukraine, who want a liberal Western-style democracy, want to join the EU. Pretty clear they want to join NATO. They want to join that club I'm talking about, and that is a club that the United States doesn't dictate to, but the United States is the major player in that club. It sets the rules, it enforces the rules, it has a lot of influence, even in countries. The claim here is not that a country like France loves the United States and does whatever the United States wants. Obviously not. But France is an old, dependable ally of the United States by and large. And Russia doesn't want more of those countries on its border. That's not an argument to say we should leave Ukraine alone or let Putin have his way in Ukraine. It's just a caution. We need to recognize two things. It's good, it would be good in many ways for Ukraine to become a democracy, former Soviet Georgia, other countries. But one of the risks has to do with the enhanced power that would accrue to the United States. and what that would do to Russian interests. And Putin already knows this. Putin is very aware of this. That, I think, helps explain what looks to us like paranoia. I don't think it's paranoia. Again, I'm not supporting what he's doing. I'm trying to make sense of it. So those are my 2 points.
Well, thank you for being here, the invitation. I am very cognizant that I'm the one who's not resident at UVA, and so your patience with me is appreciated. Although I do appreciate that you have President Madison here on the wall to inspire me, given that I come from Montpelier. The question is actually somewhat interesting because we're asking about promotion versus export. And that's something that's, I think, in modern America, we need to distinguish quite a bit. Post-Soviet Russia, the USSR began to dismantle itself. It really was the U.S. policy to try to essentially cut and paste a U.S.-formed, over 180-year democracy or republic, to really just cut and paste and export that to former Soviet states. And I think history has shown that that has not been wildly successful there, or if we've tried to do that on the African continent or anywhere else. So should we be exporting American democracy? I would say the answer is pretty easy, no. Because again and again it's shown that it's a failure. But should we be promoting the values and the constitutional principles? I think that's a resounding yes. And where I might depart from my colleagues is I don't think it's simply investment that we can make around the edges. I think we do have to be promoting some level of principle that says we need gender equality, that we need stable government in order for trade to work. We need to make sure that we are focusing on a contemporary, applicable position for new and struggling democracies to take. So, post-World War II, we've entered into an interesting rights-based constitution-making process, where so many of these young nation states have gotten into the process of writing new constitutions. In fact, it was just Iceland, 2 summers ago, that decided they were going to crowdsource their constitution. It's kind of unique in and of itself. But Hungary's gone through it, now Scotland's considering independence itself. Well, as that happens, the first thing that constitution writers are thinking of is rights-based constitutions, largely modeled after the South Africans. If you ask Senator Day O'Connor today, should countries be following the U.S. Constitution when they're writing hers? She's likely to say, as she said in the past, well, they really ought to look at South Africa, and Canada's not bad either. It's not to say that the U.S. Constitution or our constitutional principles, the values that have gone into it, that have built our democracy, are null and void, but it's simply to say that post-World War II, we really are in a rights-based constitution-making posture. So with that said, I think we do have the ability, and I would say that we have the impetus to be promoting rights-based forms of self-representation, citizenship. We want to look for more inclusivity. We want countries to be challenged to develop the kinds of systems that bring stability so that we can address a whole series of issues, everything from hunger and poverty to trade needs to regional conflict. So, do we promote? Yeah, we probably should be promoting. Do we export? Absolutely not.
Great. Thanks, everybody. That's excellent. It gives us a lot to think about. Given that, I guess we're all kind of on the same page as to the first question, probably yes, the world would be better with some caution if democracy was promoted. I'll let maybe some people in the audience will push you back on that general question. But I'll take it kind of to the next step and talk about the how of doing it. Mike, I appreciated the context thing that you mentioned. What do you guys think is the sort of the biggest obstacle to democracy being promoted? What's the low-hanging fruit? What's the first step? Is it might not be regime change? Is it economic development? Is it winning over the kind of hearts and minds, selling people on democracy? Where, if you could only do, and I know that's a silly question, but if you could only do one thing, where would you start?
So, to respectfully disagree and I guess somewhat modify what Doug had said, I would be reticent to say constitutional engineering in the absence of something like the requisite level of economic equality. And the reason is, once you begin to, allowing people to go to the ballot box is certainly a worthy enterprise. But absent economic equality, the political elites who held power in the previous regime are unlikely to accept that new outcome, and they're unlikely to accept that new outcome for good reason from their perspective, because they expect that the new enfranchised masses are going to expropriate all of their wealth. And so, in the absence of fixing that element of a lot of these societies, I think constitutional engineering can't be the first step.
So the blue fingers only go so far, in other words.
Yeah.
Those kinds of sort of symbolic gestures of political things if the economic infrastructure isn't there to support it.
That's right. I think it makes for a good PR campaign, but it doesn't make for successful democratic consolidation. And of course, we can't have a democracy without civil and political rights. Those are the backbone of a democracy, but neither can we have a constitutional convention absent the requisite conditions that allow for democracy to flourish.
Great. You guys have anything to, any more thoughts?
Well, I would add to equality, maybe going a little beyond that. It seems that having a stable middle class is a great boon to developing a sustainable democracy, by which I mean property holding. A lot of people have to own some property, have a stake in a stable economy. And there has to be, centrist political parties, at least the potential to form and remain. It's not to say extreme parties of the left or right can't be present. They have to be small. The middle class, if you look at, there was a wave of democratization that took place in Latin America, Southern Europe, Asia in the 70s and 80s. And it didn't take place in the 50s or 60s, so why was that? And we don't really know, but one of the better answers seems to be, well, those countries had reached a certain level of economic development by that point, so that the middle class, there was a middle class, first of all, that really wanted a stable liberal democracy. Both in normative terms, they aspired to that. We're a real country, we deserve this, but also they had, they did not like the far right or the far left anymore. It was too risky and too arbitrary and so on. They wanted the sorts of institutions that wealthy and wealth-gathering countries have. So that simply is not the case in a lot of places right now. I think it's one low-hanging bit of fruit, of course, is the Bush administration's policies in Iraq, thinking that, I'll caricature, but not by too much. Some in the Bush administration thought if we just get rid of the dictator and the Ba'athist party, then everyone's inner Democrat will come out, and the Iraqis who want democracy will just make it happen spontaneously. And that's a real, for political science, it's just extremely naive. And the tragedy is there were people in the Bush administration and State Department who knew this wasn't going to work, and they would not allow much influence. So these things are generally known. But the larger message is, this is heavily conditional, right? You can have free elections, and then you can have the losers mobilize and start a civil war. That sort of thing has happened not too long ago in some places. So the conditions have to be correct. So I appreciate having you're separating out the point. Yeah, if we could wave a magic wand and have democracy, that of course it would be good. The really tricky question is how to get there. And there's some places that can't, at least not through action of the United States, cannot get there right now. But this is where it gets to Doug's remarks about, I think, promotions, slowly encouraging certain conditions in countries. But it has a lot to do with economic development.
And I would agree with that, actually. I think that the liberal market development sets the pitch. And I think that you can't ignore, there's no silver bullet. You can't ignore that there needs to be liberal market development. There needs to be kind of cultural change and preparation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Take us all the way back. It was a unique system that created what we have in the United States.
And I'm glad Tocqueville I see a few of my former students out there who know I bring the Tocqueville bust into class. I mean, I'm a huge fan, so thanks for bringing them up. I would have had you not. And you mentioned that democracy is tough, right? I mean, it's not an easy thing to implement. Your guy, Madison, a big fan of constitutional checks on the power of government. What happens if, we kind of do our thing, promote some democracy, and what they come up with is an unlimited, ancient Greek style direct democracy with no constitutional checks? I mean, is that, in some sense, what if we create something even worse than what was there before?
That's a great question. I mean, what if we suddenly have people voting and they vote in the Muslim Brotherhood? Didn't
Yeah, exactly. Was Mubarak maybe even better than what the democracy,
I mean, this has been the fear of Palestine. I mean, in Palestine all along, is you look for widespread reforms there, do you actually lose more power than you gain? And it's risky. But what would our guy say?
He'd drop copies of the Federalist Papers down in helicopters and just everybody reads that.
Yeah, but I guess, this is one of the big tensions, right? So, Egypt holds relatively free and fair elections, and to John's point, there was certainly not the requisite number of centrist parties or a centrist party in place.
There was one party.
There was one party, they elect Mohamed Morsi. We don't particularly like that, but we being, at least in the popular media. But that's a very tricky issue is we want to promote democracy, and when citizens abroad elect those leaders that they perceive will be best for their society, is it then our job to go in and change that? Probably not. And so I think supporting these baseline conditions allow for moderation, whether or not we like the particular leader or not. I mean, we're never going to agree. We don't even agree with our own leaders a lot of times, let alone abroad. So I think promoting moderation, regardless of whether we like the individual, is key. And we can't just stop promoting democracy when we think their policies are antithetical to that which we stand for.
Yeah, and that gets to this issue of, is promoting democracy, is our job to kind of get the ball rolling? Or, I mean, democracy takes maintenance over time, right? After, do we step in, kind of show them the way, help them establish these free institutions, and then kind of be like, all right, we're out of here and the show's yours now. Yeah. Is that almost irresponsible? I mean, do we owe them sort of, we'll check back in 6 years and make sure, you're still holding regular elections and fair elections and all parties. I mean, how does that, when does our obligation kind of lift?
Let me talk for about 1 minute about a case of where the United States, in fact, did forcibly impose democracy. West Germany did similar things in Japan, and I know that Germany gets a little better. Now, this is an extraordinary circumstance that is never repeated, like Nazi Germany in World War II and so on. But it is an extreme, we learn from the extreme cases too. So how did the United States make that work? Because a lot of people, even a lot of Americans in the Roosevelt administration didn't think Germany could or should be made into a liberal democracy. They wanted Germany to be, it started 2 world wars in 25 years. They're done. Germany's done. It's going to become a farming nation and have no army, no industry. And then the Cold War started to get going in 1946, and the Truman administration, it really is a tactic to win over German sentiment to say, well, we're now for a united democratic Germany. It was really a tactic in the early Cold War to make Germany a democracy. Well, how did the United States do it with some help from Britain and France? It did a lot of things. It denazified Germany. That is, found Nazis in the bureaucracy, but not all. But it didn't denazify all the way down. It did a pretty heavy job of finding people, putting them on trial, getting them out of government. But it didn't go all the way down. That's key. It made some compromises. It handed over lots and lots of money in the form of the Marshall Plan to help the Germans rebuild industry. This was extremely expensive. It did this to all of Western and Central Europe. Parts of the Soviets didn't occupy. It did it to Japan as well. Just lots of cash. Third, the United States helped build political parties in West Germany. And the main one it worked on was the Christian Democratic Party. It picked out this man, Konrad Adenauer, to run the party. He was, An anti-Nazi had been in prison, was mayor of Cologne, very important. But the United States picked these people, worked with them, did similar things with Italy and Japan. It took a lot of years, a lot of money, a lot of effort, and a lot of intervention, a lot of intrusion, right? Germany was not West Germany was not a sovereign country until 1949. Even then, American troops were everywhere. So all that to say, it does work under really extreme cases when, say, the German people realized they really messed up badly. They were beaten down. They were looking for some kind of external help. The United States had a lot of money, had a lot of legitimacy, right? So that's a long way of answering the question of having to say, if it's the most successful cases we have involve the United States bearing costs that we're probably not willing or able to bear anymore, right? Just in monetary terms or nothing else.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, just to switch gears a little bit, I guess, what do you guys see as, and I know it's impossible to kind of look into the future, it's a silly, fun game that we get to play on panels like this. If not democracy, what? I mean, if in fact the U.S. were to sit back and say, you know what, it's too complicated, it's too hard, we're not willing to make the sacrifices that it's going to take, what fills that vacuum? I mean, is the world kind of trending naturally towards liberalization? Or, I mean, is this how serious is this problem? Is the alternative a kind of statist Chinese model, maybe? Or is it, Kim Jong-un? I mean, what's the danger if we don't do it?
That's really the separation. I mean,
Yeah.
yes, those who are prepared to reform and move into more representative systems, they will become more liberal democracies. Those who are unprepared will fight that. And by virtue of fighting that, they will become more regimes.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a deeply unsatisfying answer that I'm going to give because I think it's we can't know, and oftentimes we can't do much. So if you notice the ebb and flow of headlines, Syria, really tragic conflict that's now gone on for years, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, no end in sight. It looks like individuals are settling in to the idea that Assad is not going anywhere, at least for the time being. And that in part was due to the fact that United States policymakers had looked out at Syria and said, well, we support the Syrian Free Army, or at least factions of it, but we don't support these extremist elements with explicit links to Al-Qaeda. And for good reason, but then that puts us in this dilemma where we would prefer for Assad to go, both in terms of democracy promotion and for a lot of other reasons. It's Iran's biggest ally in the region. It would be geopolitically important for the U.S. to increase its allies there. But we confront a situation like that, I think it's a window into the challenge we face. And I don't think we have good answers. I think what the United States can do, as I've alluded to, is where possible, begin to promote or provide inducements to regimes to support moderation and opening up. In some cases, I think that's the best we'll be able to do, absent some catalytic or exogenous shock that allows us to do something, or not.
Yeah, you asked if something like this, with democracy, the way of the future is liberalization. 20 years ago, most of us thought, yeah,
End of history.
Exactly, yeah. Fukuyama's end of history thesis and so on. And since then, there are still people who believe that. I'm on a panel next week at a big conference in Toronto where people who organize panel believe that's still true, but a lot of people don't believe it. And I think the main reason is probably China. That China has continued to grow, double-digit growth, GDP growth, although it's slowing down now deliberately to 7% or so. But it's foiled all the profits of its doom, right? And it's remained it's a semi-capitalist economy, but it's a Leninist political system. That is, a single party monopolizes political power. And that party has just started to embark on a very risky set of reforms to switch China from an exporting juggernaut, a production-oriented, to a consumption-oriented economy. It may not pay off. Right? They're aware of the risks. It's sort of like turning a vast ship around to go in a different direction. And there are lots of risks. But what impresses me is the Chinese Communist Party, and wish China were a multi-party democracy. But I have to admit, they're very smart, absolutely brilliant people who are anticipating China's future problems and are able to impose solutions, policies on the entire country in a way that a democratic government can't. So all this is leading some people to think, actually authoritarian capitalism, if you want to call it that, looks like a pretty good system in the 21st century. This in turn is having demonstration effects in other countries. Countries that want to develop and become great look at the United States and think, well, that's a pretty good model. It takes a long time to grow on that model. Look at China. Look how fast they've grown, and they've done it through a single party. So for me, the success, relative success of great powers has a huge influence on which political system has momentum globally. And right now, the Chinese system looks to be on a roll. 5 years from now, it could look very different. But right now, it looks to be on a roll. Not to say that liberal democracy is doomed. I think in the long run, liberal democracy outperforms. But the long run is a long time.
And certainly, as you put it nicely, I like that, authoritarian capitalism or the Chinese state is probably a preferable alternative to Assad or Kim Jong-un.
Assad or Chairman Mao's the old Chinese state back in the Cultural Revolution. Yeah,
so,
you bet.
So if the world were to shake out into Western liberal democracies and sort of alternative Chinese, that model, that would be the end of the world, hopefully.
No, but I would be concerned, if I've talked to some Chinese scholars about this who believe their system is better, certainly for them. One concern I would have is if we got into an international competition over exporting our systems at the same time, the way we did with the Soviets. This is a big cause of trouble between the U.S., our country, and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We were competing for influence and trying to spread our regimes. And it was just both sides were caught up in this competition and neither could opt out, really. We're not in that situation with China. One reason why we get along better with China is we're not in that situation. They say they don't care about exporting or promoting their system. They just want it for themselves. That could change. And things could get a bit more dangerous in certain parts of the world.
So I did a little, I got on the interwebs in advance of this, did a little Googling, found a Pew research poll that said only 18% of Americans think that promoting democracy should be a top priority of the administration. Should we be concerned? Is that number surprising? Well, you probably knew that because it's what you do, but is that concerning? Should that be more? Does it need to be in order for us to be effective at promoting democracy?
Well, the first thing I would say is I think Americans have equated recently democracy with this sort of now pejorative term nation building.
Right.
So they don't have the appetite for nation building to the extent that we've been doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it also depends, for what purpose would one promote democracy? Is it because we want a more pacific world in which conflicts are reduced? Or is it because we normatively like the idea of spreading liberal democratic values? Two very different things. And so one of the reasons we also have less conflict with China, I would argue, is this economic interdependence argument. So we were not interdependent with the Soviet Union by a long shot to the extent that we are with China. And so if it's just a matter of reducing the level of conflict in the international system, maybe it's less of a problem that we're not actively promoting democracy. I tend to be skeptical of those numbers, as I alluded to, because I think Americans are equating that with nation building.
So it could be a problem of terms, this think democracy that we talk about spreading sounds heavy-handed. What we really mean is, globalization, more freedom, women's rights, minority rights, constitutionalism, maybe democracy is too strong.
No, I think when you're polling people, the 18% think, yes, we've got to have American democracy throughout the world.
Like bicameralism.
Yeah, if the other 18% say, oh, if that equals war, I'm done.
Yeah.
I think we very much have seen war on terror as democracy building.
So that was our attempt and psychologically didn't pass the test.
I think people are tired.
Yeah, you don't have data on 10 years ago, what that
Yeah,
was.
it's the highest. I do actually, believe it or not.
Yeah.
The highest it was It got up to, I think, 31% right after September 11th. It's never been that high. It's run in the 20s generally, but 18 is, we're not at the lowest, but it's near the lowest that it's been. And yet, there were other questions, you know, should we promote value, like human, you know, freedom and things like that, and that's all like 45, 50, 60%. So that makes me wonder if it's this question, if democracy is kind of this like buzzword that people get scared, like, here's our copy of the U.S. Constitution, good luck.
Well,
that shouldn't be what we mean when we say promoting democracy.
yeah, democracy itself is a bit of a loaded, we haven't even defined democracy.
Yeah.
If you've noticed, it's a bit of a loaded term, right? Does it mean free and fair elections? Does it mean political and civil rights? Does it mean gender equality? And so this idea that we should promote the tenets of democracy, like giving people the right to exercise a choice in the selection of their leaders, promoting gender equality and things, people are more on board with that, and even scholars in political science can't agree on the definition of democracy. So I wouldn't even phrase it that way. Anyway, I'd be willing to dispense with the term democracy entirely, I think, and just talk about promoting those components of what we conceive of as this broader umbrella.
And I bet the panel you're on next week is titled "How to Promote Democracy."
No, yeah, something like it's called something like the Triumph of Democracy and the Eclipse of the West.
That doesn't sound
No,
threatening
it
at all.
sounds incoherent, actually, but they say it hangs together. Yeah, I mean, if you poll people around the world as to whether they like democracy and why, most people in 2014 say yes, but it's just a word. It's a powerful word. Some people mean different things. Some people don't know what it is, don't know what they mean. They just know it's a good thing. So the United States under the Bush administration was often accused of trying to impose American, like the Federal Papers and Mr. Madison's Constitution on, well, the Bush people protested, no, that's not what we're doing. We're quite flexible, it has to be contextualized, but the perception that it's the United States imposing its system was widely held, and I think invincible. There's nothing the U.S. could do then or now to defeat that. And so that led to this backlash. It led to a lot of failures in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think this is reflected in the polling figures in the United States. If it's what we try to do in Iraq, no. The rest of people say no. And there's this, 18% still say yes. I'd like to know who those folks are.
Yeah. But there's probably no one on the planet that says, I want less voice in government.
Right, that's right.
More authoritarian.
So that's telling. That's telling us something. Now, I will say, in the United States, it promoted democracy. I mentioned West Germany, but West German system is different from the U.S. system in a lot of ways. As a chancellor, parliamentary system, it is not identical to the U.S. Germans were heavily involved in putting it together. Same with Japan. The U.S. actually wrote the Japanese Constitution for them, but it's a very different system than we have as well. So the U.S. on that is I think better than its reputation. Americans, when they promote democracy, they realize they get there on the ground and they realize this is a different culture, a different history, and there are people here who are liberal Democrats, but they're not Americans. They have their own way of setting this thing up. So I want to just, since I'm raising this because Mike said we still haven't defined liberal democracy. I think the best way to think about it globally is in pretty abstract terms. That is to say, democracy roughly means majority rule, but sustained over time, not just one time. And liberal, that's a fraught term in American politics, but it really means having checks and balances on the Constitution that checks, that recognizes certain individual rights. And you can fill in the list in a number of ways. The right to a trial by jury, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, these sorts of things. But there are different ways to articulate that, different ways to enshrine that. But I also would say, democracies, if it has any meaning, it can't be anything goes, whatever you think is democracy.
Right.
We know that also doesn't work. So we can delineate it, but we want to be very flexible about it.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up. I'll finish with this, and then we can open it up to questions. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the obvious Russia-Ukraine issue going on. I mean, if you didn't know any better, you look, 95% of them voted to secede. Is this democracy democracy in its purest form, right? I mean, how do we make sense of movements like this when we're not there? You know, from our perspective, obviously, we have certain interests that we want to happen, and yet, I mean, is this a great example of democracy in motion, or the worst example?
President Putin says so.
Right, yeah.
Uh,
But is that just from our perspective, or, I mean, what is the objective standard by which we measure this action is democratic because it happens to fall within our, or promote our own interests, and this doesn't seem to be?
Well, I don't want to quote from The Onion, but I'm going to. There's this really, it's actually not so funny for the people living there, but there was this article in The Onion that said, you know, Crimeans excited to exercise democracy for the last time. And you know, so 2 points. One is you should always be skeptical of numbers above 60, 70% anyway, right? 95, forget about it. It's clearly electoral manipulation. The second point, which you're raising, is an interesting one, is voting into a regime that is not democratic. I don't really know what to make of it. I mean, we would first want to know whether the elections were fraudulent. My hunch would say yes. And then we would want to think very seriously about, and of course we're not really doing much, so in the way of promotion, but the exercise of a vote, even if for show, is an interesting one when they're entering into the orbit of a regime that's not democratic. That wasn't really I just don't know what to make of it.
Yeah, no, yeah.
They're alienating their rights. Mr. Jefferson said they're not supposed to do that.
Yes,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah. Look, I think, yes, there's bound to be fraud. Also, there are all these Russian troops there, so it's not a fair election. So it's also a snap election, so the opposition had no time to organize. So there are all sorts of problems. My guess is because more than 60% of Crimean residents are Russian speakers, a free and fair referendum might have come out with a 60-odd percent rather than 96%. But this is so I don't want us to evade your question by saying, oh, it was just fraudulent. My guess is the majority would have voted to secede even under ideal conditions. So what does one do with that? Well, you know, Ukraine, there are different ways to look at this. One is Ukraine has a say. It's their country. You know, another is, gosh, Russia has a Chechen minority who would love to do, let them have a vote and they'll split it off as well. Yeah, so, you know, President Woodrow Wilson, is this picture in here? Yeah, okay. Oh, he is, okay. He announced, among his program at the end of World War I was self-determination for all people. Self-determination. He didn't really say what it meant. It sounded great. Who could be against it? Self-determination. He meant it roughly as a way to bust up the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian and Ottoman empires. And the British and French too, but he didn't emphasize that as much. It created all kinds of problems in Europe because lots of ethnic groups that liberals had never heard of said, "Aha, we get a country. We're as good as them, and we get our own country." And we are seeing something like that again. This is just a tricky problem. It's a boundary drawing problem. You know, if you have self-government, self-determination, people want to decide who the self is that's determining. And Americans have a 10-year for this problem because our boundaries were arrived at through a peculiar kind of expansion in the 19th century. We're not used to thinking in these kind of ethnic people groups tied to territories. But a lot of the world is organized that way. So I don't have an answer. I guess I'm sort of blowing up the problem, making it's a lot more severe than just Crimea.
Yeah.
Once you start saying, hey, everybody gets not only to vote for their president, but gets to vote about what country and what boundaries, it is a recipe for trouble. And it's very hard to figure out how to deal with that in theory or practice.
I think your last point would be my point, which is if the Ukrainian government allowed this to get out of their hold, to allow a foreign nation to call for an election within one of its territories in order to essentially have a land grab, then shame on them.
Yeah.
You know, so that shows you there's a problem in the way that we are structured. And it portends that you have nation states suddenly leaving, parts of nation states leaving from the mothership, as it were, because of ethnic or religious or, whatever rationale, and becoming independent or saddling themselves to current, different nation states. I think the recipe for conflict there is really tremendous. And the last thing I'll say, and I don't know that much about the Ukrainian system, is I think it's interesting how silent China has been to this process. Given the landmass that they're dealing with and some of the ethnic groups that they're dealing with, they would normally side with Russia pretty quickly. But here, I think that they're keeping their head down and their fingers tight.
Sure. Excellent. All right. Well, thanks, guys, for letting me go for a while. Let's open it up. If anybody has specific questions for anybody or just kind of generally to the panel.
First, thank you, really enjoyed it. I have a question, but it's sort of a different question. But do you think the U.S. its objective is actually to promote democracy, but the U.S. is doing the work? Do you think that's their main objective? If that is, then what about, say, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, and all these other countries? Do you think that's their objective? Or do you think it's either A, to establish an ally in the region, or B, to sort of establish a corporate country of the US? Or do you think promoting democracy is the actual objective of this?
Well, the short answer is you could read the article John and I co-authored. We answered just that question. No, but I mean,
On your stands now.
if only you're on the UVA network and you have access to the journal. So, look, I mean, there's two ways to answer it. One is, does it matter? So if the outcome is democracy promotion, but we intervened on behalf of geopolitical or economic interests, would we actually care? Some would say yes. Others who are more utilitarian might say no. The more pertinent question, I think, is what are the conditions under which the U.S. stops promoting authoritarian regimes, whether it then promotes subsequently democracy or just stops supporting its old dictator friends. And there's a variety of conditions under which it will do that. One condition under which it will not do that is when opposition elites in that country are deemed antithetical to U.S. interests. So there's the initial question of when do we stop supporting authoritarianism, our authoritarian client allies, and the second question is once we've done that, do we promote democracy or not? So there's sort of a layered response, I think, to what you're saying.
But to, obviously, I have to agree, we're in print, but to take a different angle on your question, I think in most cases, the United States promotes democracy instrumentally. That is to say, it certainly needs to do it, but it's not for its own sake, usually. It is for the sake of something else, for some geopolitical advantage or an economic advantage, right? So, now, the question for a social scientist then becomes, so why does under what conditions would promoting democracy be in America's interest? That's kind of interesting, because it sometimes promotes dictatorships. In some cases, it actually helps suppress democracy to keep. And those are the cases when a U.S. president, this goes for Democrats as well as Republicans, we have the goods on a lot of presidents here, judges that free elections would yield a government that doesn't like the United States and would break off. And that obtains, so that might be the case. Egypt is a partial case study, right? Obama administration did not know what to do when Mubarak was tottering in January, February 2011. Did not know what to do. Frantically looking around for some democratic alternative. Mohammed al-Baradei, no way. Egyptians didn't like him. So they end up with Muslim Brotherhood government. Obama tries to work with them. It's very, very tricky. Saudi Arabia, I think, would be maybe a more extreme case. Why doesn't the United States push for Saudi democracy? Because it thinks the result may be pretty bad for U.S. interests. That's just the way it is. Now, in other countries, like, to pick my favorite one, in West Germany, after the war, the opposite was true. It's the Democrats didn't like the United States, so therefore the United States puts them in power and helps them set up a regime. But this is another condition we need to attend to.
I think
Sure, go ahead in the back, yeah.
So promoting democracy is kind of abstract. I mean, aren't there any less, for America, self-interested ways of promoting human flourishing? I'm thinking dollar for dollar, wouldn't exporting public health and helping kids live at the age of 5 be a better investment? I'm thinking so Bush's AIDS initiative kind of thing. And that might win us more friends, and they're going, well, what are they trying to get out of this? And he says, well, they just they're trying to help us live. Wouldn't that be? I don't know. Wouldn't that be better?
$4 trillion buys a lot of antibiotics, or something. It would be your.
Yeah,
Okay, so you should-
A lot of clean water, yeah.
Yeah, that's why USAID foodstuffs are branded with USAID. And the idea is that when you're doing international aid, you want to put your brand on it because you want to remind people this is where it's coming from. You want to soften the conflict. But there are nation states where either those food items don't get to where they need to go, even sometimes through independent international NGOs. Or worse, they're rejected because they don't produce. The reality is, if you want people to flourish, you have to make those investments. I think one of the things we've learned in Africa, so I'm the former chair of the board of Heifer Project International. They do international relief and development, livestock-based. We've got this great Gates grant to work in Uganda and Rwanda, and where in the past we might have worked with individual families, setting them up with livestock. What we did was we worked with Gates, and we realized what we really needed to do was build local cooperatives. And so we started building these kind of regional markets, and then how do you create regional markets and value chains all the way to capital, and then you have true regional markets with product. That worked. The byproduct of it was that you had Hutu and Tutsis who a generation ago were killing each other, now in business together. And so, yeah, there are opportunities that you can do to flourish, but you do have to have the right stability and functioning systems in place for that to happen. If those systems are gone, or there is regional conflict, or you are dealing with displaced persons, to be honest with you, NGOs generally don't go in.
Yeah, and just to pick up on this point, there's actually some scholars at Yale have done some experimental work out in northwest Afghanistan and other areas there, and they've actually found that civilians who receive ISAF, so the NATO-led force, ISAF-branded aid, actually increase their support for the Taliban in those regions, and not NATO. And whereas it's more general, it's, so this is, to take Doug's point very seriously, is aid and development does sound very good, but that also is context dependent. And so where we've previously garnered the relative, or eradicated all goodwill we had with the population, just throwing development at it afterwards isn't going to function. So I think it's really dependent upon certain conditions there as well, or at least rebuilding partnerships rather than just throwing aid.
So my question is quite similar, but I wanted to hone in on the fact that you said that economic development is the single best way to build a country that's conducive to democracy building. And obviously a proactive more than reactive foreign aid and foreign development will sort of build stability, like you said, that is needed in order for democracy promotion. And I think that if you look at the recipients of foreign aid who got the most, it was maybe South Korea, Western Europe, these are countries that have flourished. Now, you can always pick allies in Afghanistan, but maybe that's more a product of sort of aggressive foreign policy. What would you say to that?
So the general question is, when we look out at where development has gone, its efficacy seems to be pretty high. Is that the...
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, development on average, political scientists seem to be keen on development for a variety of reasons. So where it's worked, it's promoted things like education, moderation, as John noted, expands the middle class. The great kind of anomaly for the development, which means kind of GDP, not necessarily inequality, is India, right? India's GDP is well below what political scientists typically peg as the GDP level conducive for democracy, which is something like $6,000 GDP per capita. And so I think it's not economic development in the abstract. I think it's the externalities that economic development generates as to why it's been successful. And what we would want to do is look at those cases of success and actually determine whether it was, in fact, economic development or there were some alternative factors. And to the extent that we can be confident that that was a significant causal factor, we should begin to.
And I would say, too, you were referring to development aid, I guess, the United States, or rich countries giving aid to...
But maybe like not the kind of outdated type of foreign aid that maybe I think you alluded to in Afghanistan, where sort of corruption seeps in, because actually there's been so many constitutional mechanisms in the last 15 years to completely eliminate that problem, almost entirely.
So I'll put in a plug for, not as a panacea, but economic trade, importing goods from poor countries, so that, and we're quite hypocritical about this, right? We demand that they open their economies, through the World Bank and the IMF, which are international lending agencies we have a huge amount of influence on. But we, of course, have certain types of, we don't do certain things we demand that poor countries do for themselves. Certain types of hidden protectionism we practice, agricultural subsidies being probably the main one. So I think, again, it's not a panacea, but one thing we can do to help countries become wealthier over time is to trade with them freely and fairly. Again, I accept the literature that says that it really helps develop democracy when you have people in poor countries starting their own property and own businesses and do their own thing that well, and not working for foreigners all the time. And so trade, I think trade rightly done is an essential instrument, but it's not the only instrument.
And it's not just the international policy. I'm glad you brought up the trade distortions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we struggle with the farm bill every 7
Yeah,
years
yeah.
in this country, and it takes us 9 years to get. Well, in there, we have these trade distorting subsidies for things like cotton. So if you are a Malayan cotton farmer, and USAID is giving you aid in order for you to build a cotton farm, for you to put your cotton out on the market. At the very time, our domestic policy is subsidizing U.S. farmers that actually make it cheaper for them to. We've got to think much more holistically about the way we do international investment. Right now, because these things are happening in silos, we actually are counteracting our international policy with our investment.
Right. Yeah.
Guys, unfortunately, this time we only have time for one more question.
Shucks. Boy. Let's go to the back. Sure.
So returning back to the topic of Crimea and democracy promotion, recently in the news, sort of the argument has been made a few times that perhaps the United States is being a little bit hypocritical as we've done such things as invade Iraq and try to influence the government there. You could, of course, make several arguments as to why those two cases are different or similar, but I think it returns to the concept of sort of the perception of it, whether an election is held or not, whether that's a true election or not. And it makes me wonder, and what I want to pose as a question is, as we start sort of seeing the return of a bipolar or multipolar world on the horizon, should we begin to think about democracy promotion in the sense that are we encouraging other countries to sort of engage in the same sort of activity that we maybe have been overprivileged in a way, and thinking that we can sort of get away with in our sort of super world or superpower status? So do you think that we should start thinking about the consequences of democracy promotion in the sense that we might be encouraging other rising powers to sort of engage in senseless promotion of their own regimes?
We've set some precedents that we wish we hadn't set.
Yeah, totally. Somebody
It's a very good point. I mean, it depends on whether you think Putin cares about precedent at all or whether he would do these things anyway. I think he would want to do them, but we haven't made it harder for him, let me put it that way. And it isn't, and these Putin-Hitler comparisons are, we have to be very careful. He's not Hitler. But Hitler made a lot, I mentioned Woodrow Wilson's self-determination, but you know, one big argument Hitler made for taking pieces of Czechoslovakia Slovakia, Gdansk, Austria, is, hey, these people speak German, they want to belong to the fatherland. All we're doing is freeing them from the oppression they're suffering in the hands of these Slavs or whatever, and incorporating them into the father. That's what they want. Isn't that what President Wilson said? What? And the argument, everybody took that in the West very cynically, but it, he wasn't making this up. So Putin is able to, and if you read his speech, this is a brilliant piece of rhetoric, the speech in front of the Duma. Was it yesterday? Brilliant rhetoric. Just read it. Have a look. He's on to exactly what you're talking about. He's citing precedent, Western hypocrisy. And you're right, we can argue all day, well, this is different, and so on. And I think there are some key differences. But his argument is a very easy one to make. We've made it easy for him to do that. And not just the U.S. One case he cites a lot is Kosovo, 1999. That was a while ago. But the Europeans were all over that. This was an air war done without UN approval. And we, the French and the Brits, were bombing Kosovo for the sake of human rights, But Putin is using that as a precedent. So I don't know what to say about it. I think you're right. I don't think that's causing him to do it. I just think it's making it a bit easier for him.
Yeah, it's a good question on this point. I had also read that quote about, Kerry and others decrying the violation of self-determination, and of course, anytime a state forcibly intervenes abroad, they are violating sovereignty. Now, whether or not we believe in the cause itself as determining whether that's legitimate or not is up for debate, but the question of, do we make it easier by doing these things? It's possible, and of course, even during the Cold War, the Soviet invasion of Hungary in '56 or Czechoslovakia in '68 was couched in terms of freeing them from the strictures of capitalism, essentially. So they're sort of always using the rhetoric. Is the rhetoric causal, or is it just geopolitics cloaked in rhetorical language? I think time will tell.
All right, well, with that, thank you very much to our panelists and our moderator. So we have a Boxing Cup and a copy of the Wilson Journal of International Affairs for each of you. Thank you all for coming. Really, this has been the joint effort of IRO, the Democracy Network, and the Presidential Precinct. So I'm just going to hand it off to Daniel for a couple of closing remarks.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming, guys. If you have any further interest in presidential precinct, please talk to Mr. Neil Paper right up here. And also, if you guys have any interest in talking about this stuff more often, please come to a Democracy Network meeting. We meet every Tuesday at 8 p.m. in the open ground space down in the corners.
And just really quickly before you all leave, I'd like to hand it off to Professor Furio really quickly to talk about a new major coming to talk.
Well, I'm not going to keep you too long. I'm just going to say that I have a handout about, we could even call it a little bit of a spin-off of the existing global development studies and global public health majors, which have already closed their applications for the year. There are two new spin-offs, and they're all being put together. You may have heard about it in a global studies major together. And one of those spin-offs is a global environments and sustainability sub-major track within the major. But the other is global security and justice, very pertinent to everything you heard discussed here. So if you are interested in that particular new stuff, this is primarily second years who I'm speaking to now, or first years, think of this for next year. I have a handout and would love to chat with you about that global studies in security and justice new major. So I'll be right up.
All right, and again, thank you all for coming, and I think that almost all of our panelists and everybody will be here afterwards if you have any further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.